Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. We're now going to be talking some NFL, have a couple little fun exercises to go through, starting off with the idea of what are the biggest concerns for each of the Super Bowl contenders for the 2024 season. If I don't list a team necessarily in this exercise, it's going to be for the purpose of time. But if in the comments section you have any specific teams you would like me to hit on as well, I can do so. But I have the top 4 or 5 teams in terms of odds, and then a couple other teams that I am also interested in as well. But there's nowhere to start here other than the Kansas City Chiefs, the reigning Super Bowl champions. And one thing that I will note, maybe wouldn't call it an internal struggle by any means. I feel like their roster did actually get better in a lot of ways during this offseason, but having some of these other key quarterbacks in the AFC potentially healthier. Now, we can't necessarily predict injuries like that, but I do feel like last year the Chiefs were able to get away a little bit with the fact that Joe Burrow was injured, Trevor Lawrence, Justin Herbert. You can even throw Deshaun Watson in there. These were all players that were dealing with injuries or fully out down the stretch of last season. Now, like I mentioned, Burrow and the Bengals are obviously the main threat in this situation, but I also am expecting a bounce back year from the Jaguars. The Browns were in the playoffs last year when Watson went out during the middle of the season. It was coming off of his best game of the year, so not exactly sure. Again, we can't predict injuries necessarily, but I do feel like we could definitely see some more competition in terms of other top-tier quarterbacks in the AFC, at least available to rival the Chiefs. But in terms of their roster themselves and what you could point to in terms of a hole or a flaw, I think that the offensive line is probably the biggest thing with them, where both of their offensive tackles aren't necessarily bright spots for them. They are going to have a new left tackle in all likelihood. Donovan Smith, who was their primary starter last year, he remains a free agent. It doesn't seem like the Chiefs have all that much interest in pursuing him. So as things currently stand, it's going to be either Wanya Morris or Kingsley Suamatia. I always mess up his name. I apologize. Suamatia, who was the offensive tackle from BYU, second round pickup for them, and I did like the draft pick. I think that he can be a good pro, but it also has been sort of speculated that his game might take a little bit of time to be refined and develop before he is able to step into a situation like this. Of course, a lot of pressure blocking for the best player in the NFL in Mahomes. So his blind side could definitely be exposed on the right side. Juwan Taylor isn't necessarily a sure thing in terms of reliability from his perspective. I think Mahomes is probably at a point where he can make the necessary adjustments regardless of who's in front of him and make the most of the situation, but it is something to look to. And then really the biggest loss for them, of course, was L'Jarius Sneed, where they're just going to have to deal with a little bit more youth, you could say, in the secondary. Jalen Watson does have a lot of potential in my eyes. I thought that he's been solid in his limited role, but now as more of a defined cornerback too, assuming he does win the starting job for them, is he going to be able to maintain that next year? For the 49ers, health is always the biggest thing for them, and it's a little bit of a cop-out, but it is true because there are so many key players, specifically when you look at that offensive side of the ball, that have dealt with injury issues, and that's obviously not even including Dre Greenlaw, who I don't think should be an issue long-term in terms of is he going to be available. That was a freak injury that took place in the Super Bowl, but that torn Achilles is going to keep him out for a lot of the regular season. What's he going to look like when he returns? But on offense, at least, the offensive line, Trent Williams, like I mentioned, with the health issue. Now, 3 consecutive All-Pro first-team selections, and I think that we know when he is on the field, he is a huge difference maker. The team is much worse offensively when he's not playing in the games. Didn't top 17 points, I don't think, in any of the games that he missed last season, but he also hasn't played at least 16 games for the past decade. 2013 was the last time that he played in 16 games. So, it's more about him being available in the playoffs when those come around. I don't think it's going to make a huge difference in terms of the regular season. This is probably a little bit of a stretch of a spin zone, but if he were to be out during the regular season, at least in some instances, maybe we could see sort of how Brock Purdy reacts to that. He's going to be up for a contract extension in 2025, but we don't have to dive into all of that right now. But other side of the line, Colton McKivitz, who has been solid for the past couple years during the regular season, struggled more in the postseason, was a part of a little bit of the collapse of the offensive line in overtime that sort of helped lead to the 49ers falling in that game. So Niners, again, another very talented roster, but I do feel like if there were going to be any position group that you have doubts about, it would be the offensive line for me. And speaking of offensive line, I think the Ravens could be thrown into that category as well, as they are going to be losing 3 starters from last season, where they lost Morgan Moses and John Simpson, both to the Jets. Also saw Kevin Zeitler leave in free agency to go to Detroit. So they are definitely going to have to reshuffle a little bit. This is an offense that is very much predicated on the run game. They add Derrick Henry in the backfield, so I don't think it should be an issue necessarily, but is definitely going to be a little bit of a different look. Hopefully they can get a healthy version of Ronnie Stanley, who has been a huge piece for them since they drafted him. I believe it was in 2016 when they selected him with a top 6 pick. But ultimately here, it's going to be some new faces for the Baltimore offensive line, where it seems like Roger Rosengarten, the rookie that they drafted in the second round this year out of Washington, he's probably going to be a day one starter for them. Going to have to replace both of their starting guards as well. So we will see how it all works out for them. I think that, I just feel like this is going to be a situation where it's at least something to look at. Again, big part of their identity is running the ball, but in the passing game as well, you do lose a little bit of the depth with Odell Beckham Jr. walking in free agency, and not that he was a game wrecker necessarily for them, but their wide receiver room is just pretty mediocre. Now, you can probably expect Zay Flowers to take another step forward this year and continue to prove that he is a number 1 threat, but behind him, it's Rashad Bateman, Nelson Aguilar, who, granted, as a Patriots fan, I understand that I have some sort of bias there, but Aguilar I just do not believe in as a top 3 wide receiver. Should be interesting to see whether or not Tez Walker can make any type of a splash. He was very exciting when he played at UNC. Obviously, had to deal with the NCAA that sort of derailed his final season in college. Now, the Ravens have tight ends at least to lean on as well, so I'm sure they'll be fine, but those would be the concerning spots for me with them. We also have the Detroit Lions, who are next up, at least in terms of odds to win the Super Bowl. I'd say the biggest thing with them is the inexperience in the secondary. Now, I talked about how I loved the pickups in the draft of Terrion Arnold and Ernest Rakestraw Jr. to sort of liven up that secondary. They're just going to be under a lot of pressure, and I do like their front 7 now, but it has been that back end of the secondary, or of the defense, I should say, in the secondary that has been the biggest concern. That definitely showed up during the NFC Championship game as the 49ers put together their comeback win in this instance. Now, Carlton Davis was also a big pickup for them from Tampa Bay. I liked that move for them as well. It's just a defense with a lot of youth in that secondary. You also look at the safety positions. Brian Branch, who showed a lot of promise, as well as Ife Melifonwu. So a talented defense, but again, that has been their number one concern, it feels like, over the past couple of years. Sort of kicked up at the end of last season, and hopefully they can sort of maintain strong here. They have the pure talent to do so, but it's going to be interesting to see. We'll go a little bit rapid fire through these last few teams as we're running out of time, but the Buffalo Bills, I would say that it's definitely not having a number one wide receiver. I think that Josh Allen is good enough that he can overcome it, but we have seen instances at least that this Bills offense can maybe get a little stagnant, and I think that this could potentially help Josh Allen sort of become better at, more evenly distributing the football over the field. I thought that's when he played his best football, is when he wasn't looking to just single out Stephon Diggs and maybe work through progressions better. We'll see what Keon Coleman is. It's not like he's an elite route runner, but he is a big physical wide receiver, so we'll see with him. Khalil Shakir was a late season development for them as well. You can also point to some of the losses in their secondary, but I think that there were real concerns with some of the guys they let go of anyways. I don't think the Bills' fall off is going to be quite as dramatic as a lot of other people do. But the Cincinnati Bengals, kind of unfair, but the Joe Burrow health question, and I've said before, I don't necessarily believe that Joe Burrow has an injury problem, but it is definitely a conversation, and sort of tied into that is, are they going to have the run game to sort of help supplement him, because he has a lot on his plate as things currently stand. Teams know that he is obviously the heart of the offense. The Bengals decide to trade Joe Mixon, bring in Zach Moss, who I like Zach Moss, but is he going to be somebody who can be a definitive running back one? And they still have a little bit of depth as well at that running back position, where Chase Brown showed some flashes for them as well. I actually kind of liked Chris Evans as well when he played. Maybe it was just because of the name, but I think that the Bengals are definitely going to need to be able to run the game, which is how I feel about the run the ball, which is how I feel about the Dallas Cowboys as well. And I think that that's their biggest issue, is it's going to be a lot of Dak Prescott, which I think he's capable of during the regular season in a lot of these instances. But the running back position is definitely rough for them. They bring back in Zeke, but I don't know if he's a running back one anymore. Cheap contract, at least. They're actually paying more for his old deal for him this season than the new deal that he signed this offseason. But I think that, out behind him, it's Rico Dowell, it's Deuce Vaughn. Just going to be a lot of Dak Prescott, which I do like Dak, I feel like, more than the average NFL fan, but definitely not a super convincing path to victory in my eyes. But let me know what you think. We're now going to be taking our next break of the show. When we come back on the other side, want to look ahead a little bit to the NFL rookie quarterbacks and project when they may make their first career start. So stick with us and we will be right back.